My name is Abigail Hart. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the quiet one at the end of the dinner table. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work as a financial compliance analyst for a regional healthcare network, which, if you're wondering, is exactly as thrilling as it sounds. I'm married, no children. I read more than I talk. I listen more than I react. And at every family gathering, birthdays, Thanksgiving, those loud 4th of July barbecues where someone always burns the corn, I stayed quiet. Not silent, just quiet. There's a difference. People tend to interpret quiet women in predictable ways. They assume we're shy, unsure, maybe a little fragile. Sometimes they decide we're naive, or worse, that we don't understand what's happening around us. At family dinners, I became background texture, the one refilling water glasses, the one smiling politely while others debated politics, real estate, or whose kid was getting into which private school. If someone needed a dish washed or a logistics problem solved, they called my name. If something needed defending or confronting, they called someone else. And for a long time, I let that version of me exist. This isn't a story about screaming across a table or exposing someone in a dramatic reveal. There's no viral moment, no revenge speech, no cinematic applause. It's about something quieter than that. It's about observation, about patience, about what happens when the person everyone overlooks is the one paying the closest attention. Over the years, I watched patterns repeat. I watched how money moved, how property shifted, how decisions were made behind polite smiles. I watched how certain people were protected and how others were slowly minimized. And I noticed something else. When you don't interrupt people, they reveal themselves. What I'm about to tell you isn't dramatic. It's deliberate. It's a story about being underestimated so consistently that it becomes an advantage. It's about understanding that silence isn't surrender sometimes. It's a strategy. Most of all, it's about this observation is power when you use it correctly. If you've ever sat at a table and felt invisible, if you've ever been mistaken for weak simply because you chose not to compete for volume, you might understand this more than you think. Have you ever realized that the quietest person in the room was the one who understood everything? To my husband's family, I was Abby. Not Abigail. Never Abigail. Abby sounded smaller, easier. A name you could call from the kitchen when the serving spoon was missing. I married into the Hart family at 28. They were established in the way some American families quietly are, not flashy wealth, but layered assets. 2 rental properties, a lake house, a small but profitable construction company that my father-in-law, Richard, built from nothing and never stopped reminding people of. At my first Thanksgiving, I wore a navy dress and brought a bottle of wine I couldn't quite afford at the time. I remember standing in the doorway, hearing laughter echo from the dining room, and thinking, listen first. That instinct never left me. Over time, a pattern formed. My sister-in-law, Jenna, filled the space effortlessly. She had opinions on everything school boards, organic food, market trends. My brother-in-law, Caleb, had the kind of confidence that grows easily in men who've never been interrupted mid-sentence. And then there was I. When I spoke, it was usually to answer a direct question. What do you think? Abby, someone would ask, already halfway turned towards someone else. I would offer something measured, thoughtful, and then the conversation would glide right past it, like a stone skimming water, but never sinking in. They didn't insult me, not overtly. They just didn't register me. If a debate turned heated, I became the peacekeeper. If plans needed organizing, I was so good with details. If someone forgot an anniversary, I remembered it. If Richard needed help reviewing a vendor contract because numbers make my head spin, he handed it to me with a chuckle, as if it were a favor to me. At dinner, I usually sat near the end of the table, not by assignment, just gradually, like gravity had nudged me there. It's interesting how roles crystallize without anyone formally deciding them. I became reliable, useful, non-threatening. When I excused myself early because I had work the next morning, they'd say, she's always so disciplined, with a tone that sounded almost like pity. What they didn't see was that I wasn't overwhelmed. I was watching. When you work in compliance, you learn to read between the lines, you notice inconsistencies, casual remarks about refinancing, offhand jokes about loans between siblings, a tense pause when property taxes come up. the way someone avoids eye contact when a number is mentioned. Family dinners are rich with data. Most people perform at the table. They reinforce the identity they want others to believe. Success, generosity, control. But performance leaks. I began to see fault lines beneath the polished wood surface of that dining table. Who deferred to whom? Who resented whom? Who was quietly dependent? Still, I never challenged anything. I didn't correct their assumptions about me. I didn't push to sit at the center. I didn't compete for airtime. They mistook that for smallness, and in a way, that worked for me. Because the less space you occupy in someone's perception, the less they guard themselves around you. By the time I turned 35, I had been present for nearly 7 years of holidays, birthdays, and financial discussions disguised as casual updates. 7 years of watching assets move like chess pieces. 7 years of hearing things they forgot I had heard. To them, I was Abby, the quiet one who smiled and passed the bread. But I was also the only one at that table who understood exactly how everything connected. And they never once thought to ask what I was keeping track of. The first cut wasn't loud. It didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. No one left the table. No one cried. That's why it took me a moment to understand that it mattered. It happened on a Sunday, in early spring, at Richard and Diane's house. The windows were open, and the smell of rosemary chicken drifted into the dining room. We were discussing renovations to the lake house, something about replacing the dock and updating the guest bathroom. Richard was animated, gesturing with his fork. "I think we'll pull from the equity line," he said. "It's smarter than liquidating anything right now." Caleb nodded immediately. Jenna chimed in about resale value. My husband, Mark, stayed mostly quiet. He always did when his father was in planning mode. I hadn't intended to speak, but numbers are reflexive for me. "If you're using the equity line," I said gently, "it might be worth checking the variable rate terms again. They've shifted twice this year. Depending on how the draw is structured, it could cost more than you expect." I didn't say it to correct him. I said it the way I would at work, neutral, informational. Richard smiled. Not warmly, not coldly, just indulgently. "Well," he said, glancing around the table, "we don't need to overcomplicate it. It's just a family place." A few people chuckled. Jenna added, "Abby's always in audit mode." There it was, light, playful, but dismissive. I felt the subtle heat rise in my chest. Not anger, exactly. More like recognition. I tried once more, softly. "I just mean it might help to run the numbers side by side." Richard waved his hand. "We've managed properties for decades, sweetheart, but I appreciate the concern." Sweetheart? That word landed heavier than the rest. The conversation moved on within seconds. Dock materials, contractor timelines, whether the new bathroom should have a rainfall shower. But something had shifted for me. It wasn't that they disagreed. Disagreement is normal. It was the assumption embedded in the tone that my expertise was theoretical, academic, detached from real decisions. At work, I was the person executives consulted before signing 7-figure agreements. I had flagged regulatory gaps that saved my organization from penalties. I had restructured compliance frameworks that auditors praised. At that table, I was in audit mode. That night, after we drove home, I asked Mark casually, "Do you think your dad actually reviewed the rate changes?" Mark shrugged. "He's been doing this a long time." "That's not what I asked." He hesitated. "He probably has it handled." "Probably." I let it go outwardly. I brushed my teeth. I set my alarm. I placed my black notebook on the nightstand like I always did. But internally, I made a small adjustment. Up until that evening, I had been participating lightly, cautiously in their financial conversations, offering input when it felt appropriate. After that dinner, I stopped offering, not out of hurt, out of clarity. If expertise is unwelcome when it disrupts someone's authority, it becomes leverage when withheld. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention. Not just to what was said, but to what was assumed. I began noting timelines, loan structures. Ownership percentages are mentioned casually, like trivia. I didn't advise, I observed, because the first small cut wasn't the joke. It was the realization that my knowledge was safe only as long as it stayed ornamental. And once I understood that, silence stopped feeling passive. It started feeling intentional. After that spring dinner, nothing dramatic changed. No one apologized. No one doubled down. There wasn't a single defining moment where I could point and say, that was it. Instead, it became a pattern. And patterns are quieter than incidents. By summer, we were back at the lake house. The dock renovation had gone forward exactly as Richard planned. I overheard him mention to Caleb that the interest payments were a little higher than expected, but he brushed it off with a laugh. At dinner that weekend, Jenna was talking about investing in a boutique fitness franchise. She described projected revenue with enthusiasm, her voice bright and certain. "It's basically guaranteed," she said. "The market here is starving for something like this." I noticed the lack of a contingency plan in what she described. No buffer for lease escalations, no allowance for staffing volatility. The optimism was built on straight-line projections. I stayed quiet, not because I didn't see the gaps, because I remembered the rosemary chicken, the indulgent smile, the word sweetheart. Later that evening, Caleb asked me privately, almost as an afterthought, "You deal with contracts, right? Is there anything weird about franchise agreements?" I could have explained royalty structures, territory restrictions, exit penalties. Instead, I said, "They're usually complex. It's important to read carefully." He nodded, satisfied with the vagueness. I realized then that they preferred my knowledge diluted, usable, only when it didn't challenge their confidence. The small dismissals continued. If I pointed out a scheduling conflict, someone joked that I ran life like a spreadsheet. If I asked a clarifying question about shared expenses for the lake house, Jenna would sigh lightly and say, "It's just family. Abby, not a board meeting." Each comment was minor on its own, harmless if you viewed it generously. And for a while, I did. I told myself they were expressive people. Loud families often tease the quiet ones. It wasn't malicious, just personality. That's how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, through repetition softened by humor. At one dinner, Mark mentioned that I had reorganized our household budget and paid off one of our car loans early. Richard laughed. "Of course she did. She probably has color-coded tabs for the grocery bill." The table chuckled. I smiled, because correcting them would have required explaining that discipline isn't an obsession, that structure isn't rigid, that foresight isn't fear, and I was tired of translating myself. What I began to understand was this invisibility is reinforced by participation. Every time I absorbed the joke, every time I let my expertise be minimized into a personality quirk, I was confirming their narrative, but I wasn't ready to disrupt it. Not yet. Instead, I shifted internally. I stopped seeking acknowledgement. I stopped offering clarification. I stopped hoping they would eventually recognize my competence organically. Hope is noisy. It demands validation. Observation is quiet. So I let them underestimate me. I listened when Richard mentioned refinancing the primary residence to help Caleb with a short-term cash flow issue. I noted the casual way Jenna referred to temporary loans between siblings. I clocked the tension in Diane's face whenever shared assets were discussed. No one thought twice about speaking openly in front of me, because in their minds, I was not a decision-maker, just Abby. Reliable, organized, harmless. They didn't realize that normalization works both ways. If they could normalize dismissing me, I could normalize documenting them. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, my silence stopped being defensive. It became strategic. There's a moment in every group dynamic when you realize the role you've been given, not the role you chose, the one quietly assigned. For me, that realization came during Diane's birthday dinner. We were in their dining room again, the long oak table polished to a soft shine. Jenna had arranged flowers, Caleb brought wine, Mark was helping Richard carry in a heavier chair from the study. I was in the kitchen, not because anyone told me to be there, because that's where I always ended up. I plated the salad, adjusted the oven temperature, refreshed water glasses before they were empty. When Diane thanked me for always being so thoughtful, it sounded sincere. And it was. That's what made it complicated. I wasn't mistreated. I was appreciated, but only within a narrow frame. Halfway through dinner, the conversation turned to long-term plans, retirement timelines, what would eventually happen to the lake house, whether the construction company would be sold or passed down. Richard leaned back in his chair. "We'll keep it simple," he said. "Caleb will handle the company. Jenna's business is her own. The lake house stays in the family. We'll figure out the details when the time comes." Mark glanced at me briefly, a small flicker, then he looked back at his father. No one asked what I thought. No one asked what Mark thought, either not directly. The structure was implied. Caleb leadership. Jenna independence. Mark support. Me logistics. Later, when dishes were stacked and the table half cleared, Diane handed me a folder. Abby, sweetheart, could you look over this insurance renewal? You catch things the rest of us miss. It was said kindly, trusting, even. I took the folder, and that's when it fully crystallized. They trusted me with paperwork, not with power. They relied on my precision, but not my perspective. I was the stabilizer, the one who ensured no one tripped over details, the quiet infrastructure beneath louder ambitions. Reliable, useful, invisible. And here's the part that took me years to admit. I had helped build that role. I answered every logistical question. I reviewed every document they handed me. I absorbed every offhand remark without resistance. I made myself indispensable in ways that never threatened anyone's hierarchy. Because usefulness feels safe, visibility does not, but safety has a cost. The more I facilitated, the more they assumed I would continue to facilitate without input, without authority, without stake. On the drive home that night, Mark said, "Mom really appreciates how you help." I nodded. "That's good," I said. But in my mind, a question had begun forming. If something happened tomorrow, if decisions were finalized without discussion, where would I stand? Where would we stand? Not emotionally, legally, financially, structurally. That night, instead of placing my black notebook on the nightstand, I opened it at the kitchen table. I wrote down everything I could remember from the conversation, not opinions, facts, asset names, ownership references, verbal intentions. Who assumed what? For the first time, I wasn't documenting casually. I was documenting deliberately. Because once you recognize the role you've been assigned, you have two choices: live inside it, or prepare to redefine it. And I was no longer interested in being the quiet infrastructure that held up decisions I didn't shape. Not angrily, not dramatically, just accurately. The shift didn't happen at a dinner table. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, alone in my office. I was reviewing a routine compliance report when my phone buzzed. It was Diane. She rarely called during the workday. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice thinner than usual. "Do you have a minute?" I stepped into a small conference room and closed the door. She explained that Richard had moved some funds temporarily just to help Caleb stabilize cash flow for a few months. It involved leveraging the primary residence again. A bridge arrangement, she called it. "It's all under control," she added quickly. "But I wanted to ask, is there anything we should be aware of, just generally?" Just generally. I asked a few neutral questions. Terms, duration, collateral. Her answers were vague. When we hung up, I didn't feel alarmed. I felt alignment. All the small fragments I had been collecting, the refinancing, the equity draw, the casual loans, the assumption that everything would work out began to form a coherent structure. And that structure was fragile. Not collapsing, but exposed. I opened a spreadsheet. Not for them, for myself. I mapped what I knew. Estimated ratios, risk layering, interdependencies between properties and business revenue. If one element faltered, which others would absorb the impact? Within an hour, the answer was clear. Mark and I were more exposed than anyone realized. Not because we were reckless, because we were quiet. We had never asked for formal clarity about inheritance structures, never clarified how shared liabilities might affect us, never requested documentation of verbal promises made over wine and birthday cake. We trusted the tone of the family, and tone is not a contract. That was the moment something shifted. Not anger, not betrayal, responsibility. For the first time, I stopped evaluating the situation as an observer of dynamics. I evaluated it as a participant with skin in the outcome. That evening, at dinner, just Mark and me, I asked gently, if your parents' properties were leveraged more heavily than we realized, would it affect us? He looked confused. Why would it? Because shared assets and expectations blur lines, especially if something goes wrong. He frowned slightly. Nothing's going wrong. I didn't argue. I simply said, we should understand the structure. Clearly, he agreed in the abstract, the way people do when consequences feel theoretical. But I knew something he didn't. The numbers were no longer theoretical to me. For years, I had stayed quiet because the dismissals were personal small cuts to pride, nothing structural. This was different. This wasn't about being called Abby. It was about exposure. And in my world, exposure demands action. Not loud action, not confrontational action, prepared action. That night, I moved my black notebook from the kitchen drawer to my work bag because this was no longer an observational curiosity. It was a risk assessment. The family still saw me as the quiet one at the end of the table. They didn't know that in a single Tuesday afternoon, my silence had changed categories. It was no longer patience. It was positioning. And once you begin positioning, you don't announce it. You calculate. After that Tuesday, my silence stopped being instinctive. It became disciplined. There's a difference between not speaking because you're unsure and not speaking because you're certain. At the next family dinner, nothing outwardly had changed. Richard carved roast beef at the head of the table. Jenna described early membership numbers for her fitness studio. Caleb joked about temporary growing pains in the construction business. I listened. When Richard mentioned adjusting insurance coverage to free up some liquidity, I didn't flinch. When Jenna asked if anyone knew a good commercial attorney but waved off the suggestion of a formal review, I didn't offer names. They interpreted my quiet the same way they always had. Abby doesn't like conflict. Abby stays in her lane. Abby doesn't understand the bigger picture. The truth was almost the opposite. I understood the bigger picture more clearly than ever. But I also understood something else. Information flows most freely toward the person perceived as least threatening. So I refined my role. When Diane handed me renewal documents, I reviewed them carefully and returned them with neutral comments. When Caleb casually mentioned cash flow timing, I asked open-ended questions that sounded curious rather than probing. How long are vendor payments running now? Is that standard in your industry? He answered without defensiveness. Because to him, I wasn't evaluating. I was just making conversation. At home, Mark noticed I was quieter than usual. You've barely said anything tonight, he said one evening as we drove back from his parents' house. I've said enough, I replied calmly. He laughed lightly. You're mysterious lately. I smiled at that. Mysterious implies intention, and he wasn't wrong. In private, I began tightening our own structure. I reviewed our joint accounts, increased our emergency reserves, adjusted automatic transfers into an account solely in my name, something I had delayed for years because it felt unnecessary. Not secretive, just prudent. I encouraged Mark to accelerate contributions to his retirement plan, framed it as tax optimization, which was true. When he asked why I seemed suddenly so focused on safeguards, I said, because clarity is cheaper than repair. He didn't argue. At the next gathering, the pattern repeated. Caleb dismissed a contractor's concern as minor. Jenna joked about reinvesting profits before they materialized. Richard assured everyone that assets were solid as ever. No one noticed that I no longer reacted emotionally to any of it. Before, a subtle comment would sting. A dismissive tone would linger in my chest. Now, I felt almost detached. Not cold, just clear. Silence, when chosen, creates space, and in that space, you can think. They mistook my composure for passivity. They assumed that because I wasn't challenging them, I agreed. But agreement requires endorsement. I was simply observing. There's a quiet power in allowing people to underestimate the scope of your awareness. It lowers their guard. It accelerates disclosure. It reveals inconsistencies over time. Observation is power when you use it correctly. And I was using it correctly. By late autumn, I knew more about the internal financial strain of that family than anyone except Richard and perhaps Diane realized. But knowing isn't the same as acting. Not yet, because action, once taken, changes dynamics permanently. Silence still served me, but I could feel the horizon approaching that subtle internal line where continued observation would become complicity. And I don't tolerate complicity. Not with risk, not with structure, not with my future. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was the advantage. By winter, my habits had shifted in ways no one registered. I began waking up 40 minutes earlier. Not because I needed more time, but because I needed uninterrupted clarity. I would sit at the kitchen table with coffee and my black leather notebook, cross-referencing what had been said at the last dinner with what had been said 3 months earlier. Timelines matter. People forget what they've promised. They forget what they've implied. But patterns don't forget. Richard once mentioned that the construction company's line of credit was temporary. 3 months later, it was described as strategic leverage. 6 months later, it was simply part of the structure. Language softens risk over time. I documented those shifts. I also began educating myself beyond casual familiarity. Even though finance and compliance were already my field, family-held asset structures operate differently from corporate frameworks. Emotions blur documentation. Verbal assurances replace written clarity. So I studied estate planning models, trust structures, liability exposure across jointly discussed properties. What happens when one sibling informally subsidizes another without paper trails? What happens when primary residences are leveraged for business stabilization? Not because I expected disaster, because I refused to be surprised. At dinner, I asked fewer questions. Instead, I let pauses stretch. Silence invites filling. If Caleb mentioned vendor delays, I nodded and sipped water. If Jenna spoke about reinvesting profits, I said, that sounds ambitious. Neutral language, no endorsement, no correction. The more neutral I became, the more candid they were. One night, after 2 glasses of wine, Richard said something that almost no one reacted to. Well, he shrugged. If the worst happens, we'd just consolidate assets. It would be messy, but family figures it out. Messy. Family figures it out. I wrote those exact words down later, because messy in financial terms often means liquidating something someone assumed was secure. And family figures it out usually means the most stable person absorbs the shock. Guess who tends to be that? The reliable one, the organized one, the quiet one who doesn't protest. I also started a different kind of documentation. Not recordings, not anything invasive, just confirmations. If Diane mentioned that the lake house was meant for all the boys, I'd follow up with a gentle email days later about an unrelated topic and include a line like, "It was interesting hearing Richard talk about long-term plans for the Lake Place lots to think about." Written acknowledgement creates timestamps. Most people never think about timestamps. In my own marriage, I shifted subtly, too. I asked Mark hypothetical questions. If one sibling needed ongoing financial support, how would that work long-term? If business debt ever crossed into personal guarantees, would that concern you? He would answer casually at first, then gradually, more thoughtfully. I wasn't planting fear, I was planting awareness. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, his responses changed from blind confidence to cautious curiosity. They never noticed any of this. To them, I was still Abby, still refilling glasses, still smiling at the end of the table. But beneath that surface, 3 things were happening simultaneously. I was mapping exposure, I was clarifying my options, and I was strengthening my independence. By February, our personal financial buffer had doubled, our legal documents were updated, beneficiaries reviewed, contingency accounts established. No confrontation, no announcement, just infrastructure. Because here's something most people misunderstand about quiet strength. It's not about waiting for the right moment to strike. It's about ensuring that when a moment arrives, good or bad, you are not structurally dependent on anyone else's stability. At the next family gathering, Richard joked that I looked serious as always. I smiled softly. If he only knew, seriousness isn't tension. It's a calculation. And calculation, when done quietly, is invisible. What they never noticed was that the quiet woman at the end of the table had already begun shifting the balance of vulnerability, not by taking anything from them, but by removing herself from the blast radius. The reveal didn't happen in a dramatic way. There was no envelope marked confidential, no overheard argument behind a half-closed door. It happened in a softly lit office with beige carpeting and a wall calendar no one had flipped to the current month. Mark had finally agreed to schedule a meeting with an independent estate attorney, framed gently as just a general review. Not because he distrusted his parents, but because I had asked one simple question that lingered. If everything is as solid as we believe, then clarity should only confirm that. Clarity is difficult to argue against. The attorney, Ms. Alvarez, was composed and precise. She listened more than she spoke, which I appreciated. When Mark described his parents' general asset structure properties, the business, informal loans between siblings, she didn't interrupt. She simply asked, "Are there written agreements outlining ownership percentages and liability boundaries?" Mark hesitated. Well, not exactly. It's family. She nodded. Of course. But from a legal standpoint, family is not a category. It's a relationship. Assets still follow documentation. That sentence landed heavier than anything I had said in months. We provided what documents we had access to: partial deeds, insurance summaries, and business registration filings publicly available. Nothing confidential, just enough to sketch a picture. Ms. Alvarez reviewed them quietly. Then she looked up. There are a few things you should be aware of. Her tone wasn't alarmist. It was measured. The primary residence had been used as collateral more than once, which I suspected. But what I hadn't fully confirmed was the layering. Some obligations were directly tied to business performance. If revenue dropped below certain thresholds, exposure would increase automatically. The lake house ownership language was vague. Intended for family use appeared more than once. Intentions are not allocations. And most importantly, there were no clear separations between short-term support loans and long-term equity adjustments among siblings. Meaning, if financial stress escalated, resolution could legally impact all heirs, even those who had never benefited from the loans. Mark went quiet. I stayed still, not because I was surprised, because I was no longer uncertain. Everything I had mapped privately now had structural confirmation. Not a catastrophe, but fragility. On the drive home, Mark didn't turn on the radio. I didn't realize, he said finally. I know, I replied. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't angry. He was recalibrating. And that was the private reveal, not the legal vulnerabilities. The shift in his perception. For years, he had interpreted my caution as temperament, as a personality, as overthinking. Now he saw it as pattern recognition. Observation is power when you use it correctly. That evening, we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had been documenting quietly for months. What do we do? He asked. There it was. Not what do you think? What do we do? I didn't celebrate internally. There was no satisfaction in being right. There was clarity. We don't accuse, I said calmly. We don't escalate. We clarify boundaries, and we secure our position without destabilizing anyone else. He nodded slowly. That was the moment I knew something irreversible had occurred. Not in the family structure. In our marriage. The dynamic had shifted from assumption to partnership. The quiet woman at the end of the table was no longer just absorbing information. She was steering outcomes, and no one at the next Sunday dinner would sense that anything had changed. That's the nature of private reveals. They don't echo. They settle. Once you see the structure clearly, you can't unsee it. That's the quiet burden of awareness. For a few days after meeting Ms. Alvarez, Mark moved through life slightly disoriented, not panicked, just unsettled. He replayed conversations in his head, comments his father had made, assurances that now sounded less solid. I didn't rush him. People need time to reconcile affection with vulnerability. On Thursday night, he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "We have options, right?" We did, and each option carried a different cost. Option 1. Do nothing. Trust that everything would stabilize, hope business revenue improved, that refinancing wouldn't cascade, and that verbal promises would eventually be formalized fairly. That option preserved harmony. It also preserved exposure. Option 2. Confront directly. Demand documentation. Ask hard questions at the next family dinner. Insist on immediate structural changes. That option offered clarity, but at the price of rupture. It would trigger defensiveness. It would shift perception overnight. And once you're labeled distrustful in a family system, that label sticks. Option 3. Quiet separation. Strengthen our legal and financial independence. Reduce entanglement. Request formal clarity in calm, controlled settings, not emotionally charged ones. Prepare for outcomes without announcing fear. That option required patience. It also required resolve. Mark looked at me. If we start separating things quietly, won't that look suspicious? Only if we explain it emotionally, I said. If we frame it as standard planning, it's just adulthood. He leaned back, thinking. The irreversible part wasn't the legal adjustments. It was the internal shift from assumption to boundary. Because once you establish a boundary, you cannot return to naive participation. You either enforce it or you betray yourself. I don't want to fight my family, he said finally. I don't want you to, I replied. Silence settled between us. Not heavy, focused. Then he asked the question that confirmed everything had changed. What would you do if this were a compliance issue at work? I almost smiled. I'd document exposure, I'd isolate risk, I'd clarify reporting lines, and I'd protect the organization before the instability became visible. And we're the organization, he said quietly. Yes. The decision, when it came, wasn't dramatic. It was a nod. We choose option 3, he said. Quiet separation. Not withdrawal, not an accusation, just structure. The next steps were procedural. Adjust titling on future assets to ensure clean boundaries, limit personal guarantees, request written clarity on any expectation tied to inheritance framed as long-term planning, not distrust, avoid participating in informal financial bridges between siblings. Simple, irreversible, because once those safeguards were in place, we would no longer be silently available as a stabilizing buffer. And eventually, that absence would be felt. Not immediately, not loudly, but structurally. That Sunday at dinner, nothing seemed different. Richard joked. Jenna discussed expansion. Caleb mentioned a temporary delay in receivables. I passed the bread. I smiled when appropriate. But internally, the decision had already been made. And here's what most people misunderstand. The moment of power isn't when you confront. It's when you choose. We had chosen. They just didn't know it yet. Once a decision is made, execution should be unremarkable. That was my guiding principle. No sudden shifts, no dramatic declarations about boundaries, just paperwork, appointments, signatures placed calmly in the right spaces. Mark and I met with Ms. Alvarez again the following week. We updated our wills to clearly separate any anticipated inheritance from joint liability. We added language ensuring that future distributions, if they ever came, would not automatically merge into shared obligations without explicit consent. Boring documents, powerful implications. We also adjusted how we purchased our next asset, a modest investment property we had been considering for months. Previously, we might have structured it informally, assuming family collaboration down the line. Instead, we titled it cleanly. No shared verbal promises, no future entanglements implied. When Richard mentioned at dinner that Caleb might temporarily need access to capital for equipment upgrades, Mark responded evenly. We're tightening our liquidity this year, he said, focusing on our own long-term positioning. The phrasing was intentional. Not we can't. We don't trust the structure. Just positioning. Richard raised an eyebrow but nodded. Smart to be disciplined. He thought it was about interest rates. It wasn't. At another gathering, Jenna floated the idea of pooling family resources for a potential second lake property, a legacy investment. I sipped water. Mark smiled politely. We're sitting out new joint ventures for now. No elaboration. No apology. Caleb shrugged. More for the rest of us. And that was the moment I understood something important. They had always assumed we were available, not because they needed us urgently, but because we were stable. Reliable families subconsciously assign the strongest member as the shock absorber. Remove that assumption quietly, and the system adjusts. Behind the scenes, I continued strengthening our insulation. I increased our umbrella insurance coverage, reviewed beneficiary designations again, ensured no residual personal guarantees lingered in obscure paperwork. I also did something subtle but significant. I stopped reviewing their documents. When Diane handed me a renewal notice one evening and said, "Can you just glance at this? You're so good at catching details." I smiled gently. "I'm trying to reduce work outside the office," I said. "It helps me stay balanced." It was true. It was also strategic. If I continued acting as their informal risk filter, I would remain embedded in their structure. So I withdrew softly. No resentment. No explanation. Just absence. They interpreted it as self-care. They didn't see it as repositioning. Weeks passed. Then small signs emerged. Caleb mentioned that vendor pressure was a little tighter than expected. Jenna admitted that lease negotiations were more complex than projected. Richard commented almost offhandedly that interest rates were stubborn this quarter. For the first time, I heard strain without buffering. Because we were no longer the invisible stabilizers in the background. Nothing had collapsed. Nothing dramatic had happened. But the system felt different, less cushioned. And that's when I understood the deeper truth. You don't need confrontation to change a dynamic. You only need to remove silent support. They still saw me as Abby composed, polite, slightly reserved. They had no idea that the most significant change in the family structure had already occurred. And it hadn't required a single raised voice. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They seep. At first, it was tone. Richard became slightly shorter at dinner. Not rude, just less expensive. Where he once spoke with certainty, there were now pauses, small recalibrations mid-sentence. Caleb stopped joking about temporary issues. The word disappeared altogether. Instead, he referred to timing challenges. Language tightens when pressure increases. One Sunday afternoon, Jenna arrived 20 minutes late, visibly distracted. She mentioned renegotiating supplier contracts. Her voice carried an edge I hadn't heard before. Not fear, but fatigue. For years, minor instabilities had been absorbed quietly within the family structure. A refinance here, a short-term bridge there, informal flexibility that relied on trust and the assumption that everyone would participate if necessary. But participation had shifted. Not loudly, structurally. Mark and I had not refused anything directly because nothing had yet been formally requested. But our positioning was clear enough that no one casually leaned in our direction anymore. And that absence began to register. One evening, Richard asked Mark to stay behind after dinner. I remained at the table with Diane, clearing plates. Through the doorway, I could see their silhouettes in the study. Later, in the car, Mark exhaled slowly. He asked if we'd consider co-signing something. He said, I didn't react outwardly. And I told him we're avoiding personal guarantees this year, keeping things clean. His voice was steady, but I could feel the weight of that conversation. How did he take it, I asked. He said he understood. A pause. He didn't look like he did. Of course, he didn't. When someone you've subconsciously relied on begins declining structural exposure, it feels like betrayal, even if it's reasonable. The next few weeks were subtle but telling. Caleb stopped sharing operational updates as openly. Jenna became more guarded when discussing expansion. Diane called less frequently during the day. It wasn't hostility. It was recalibration. They were adjusting to a new reality where the quiet, reliable buffer was no longer automatically available. And here's the important part. Nothing I had done was aggressive. We hadn't accused. We hadn't criticized. We hadn't announced distrust. We had simply removed the assumption. That removal revealed fragility. At one dinner, Richard made a passing comment that lingered longer than he intended. Family used to operate differently, he said, slicing into his steak. Everyone pulled together. The statement wasn't directed at anyone, but it hovered. Mark responded calmly. We are pulling together, just in sustainable ways. Sustainable? That word settled over the table like a thin sheet of glass. Because sustainability requires boundaries, and boundaries expose imbalance. I watched their faces not with triumph, not with vindication, with clarity. For years, my silence had been mistaken for weakness. Now, my boundaries were being mistaken for distance. Both interpretations were incorrect. Silence had been observed. Boundaries were protection. The consequences weren't explosive. They were structural. Conversations grew shorter. Requests became more formal. The ease of assumption had dissolved. And for the first time, the family system was operating without its invisible stabilizer. It wasn't collapsing, but it was feeling gravity. The call came on a Thursday evening. Not frantic, but thinner than usual. Richard's voice carried something I had never heard before. Not authority, not irritation, strain. Can you both come by Sunday, he asked. We need to go over a few things as a family. When we arrived, the dining table was cleared of plates and set instead with folders. Actual folders, not casual paperwork passed between courses. That alone told me everything. Jenna looked tired around the eyes. Caleb avoided prolonged eye contact. Diane's hands were folded too neatly in her lap. Richard began carefully. The construction company is restructuring some debt, he said. It's temporary, but there are implications tied to the house and the lake property. Implications? That word has weight. He explained selectively that revenue had dipped more than anticipated, that certain guarantees were triggering earlier than expected, that consolidating obligations might simplify things until the market stabilizes. I listened without interrupting, because I already understood the structure he was circling. Finally, he looked at Mark. There may need to be some flexibility from everyone, he said. Flexibility. There it was. Not a demand. An expectation wrapped in family language. Mark's posture remained steady. What does flexibility mean? Specifically, he asked. The room shifted. Specificity is uncomfortable when assumptions are preferred. Richard cleared his throat. Possibly restructuring ownership temporarily, adjusting percentages on paper, just to satisfy lenders. On paper, I felt the quiet confirmation settle in my chest. This was the scenario I had mapped months ago. If we had not separated cleanly, if we had informally intertwined assets, co-signed casually, merged investments without clarity, this would not be a request. It would be an inevitability. Caleb spoke next. Frustration leaking through. It's not like anyone's losing anything. It's just shifting risk for a while. Shifting risk. To whom? I didn't ask it aloud. Mark did something subtle then. He reached for my hand, not for permission, but for grounding. We're not in a position to alter our ownership or assume additional exposure, he said calmly. Our legal structure is set. Richard blinked. Legal structure? Yes, Mark replied evenly. We've clarified our boundaries over the past few months. Silence. Not explosive. Not shouting. Just recognition. They hadn't known. They hadn't realized the repositioning was already complete. Diane's voice was small. Why didn't you say anything? I answered gently. Because nothing had been formally requested. It wasn't defensive. It was factual. Richard leaned back slowly, processing. So that's it, Caleb muttered. We're just on our own. You're not on your own, Mark said. You're responsible for your own structure, like we are. There's a difference. The room felt heavier than any previous dinner. Not because of betrayal, because of timing. If this conversation had happened a year earlier, before documentation, before separation, before clarity, emotions might have reshaped decisions. Now, it was too late to fix the old assumptions. The quiet woman at the end of the table had already removed herself from the automatic shock absorber position. Not vindictively, not secretly in the dark, just deliberately. Richard closed the folder in front of him. I suppose we'll have to figure it out, he said. And in that sentence, I heard something I hadn't expected. Not resentment. Reality? Family systems can survive strain, but they cannot rely forever on invisible strength. The real confrontation didn't happen at the table. It happened 2 weeks later, in Richard's study. He asked me to come early before Sunday dinner. Just me. The room smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. Awards from decades in construction lined the walls. Framed photographs of completed projects, tangible proof of a man who had built things that lasted. He closed the door behind us. I want to understand something, he said, gesturing for me to sit. His tone wasn't sharp. It was measured. When did you decide you didn't trust us? There it was. Not an accusation. A question. I folded my hands loosely in my lap. This wasn't about trust, I said calmly. It was about structure. He studied me, searching for defensiveness. He didn't find any. You could have talked to me, he said. I did, I replied softly. In small ways, about rates, about exposure, about clarity. It was usually brushed off. He didn't interrupt, so I continued. I never wanted to challenge you publicly. That wouldn't have been respectful. But I also couldn't ignore patterns once they became clear. He exhaled through his nose, not angry, just recalibrating. You think I was reckless? I think you were optimistic, I said. And optimism works until it's layered with obligation. Silence settled between us. I didn't list the refinances. I didn't cite the language shifts. I didn't reference the attorney. He already knew. What bothered you most, he asked finally. The question surprised me. Not because I didn't have an answer, because he was actually asking. It wasn't the risk, I said after a moment. It was the assumption that we would absorb it without discussion. His jaw tightened slightly. That's what family does. Family also communicates before exposure increases, I replied gently. No edge, no raised voice, just precision. He leaned back in his chair, looking at the ceiling for a moment. I didn't think you saw the whole picture, he admitted. I allowed a small, almost invisible smile. I always saw the whole picture. That wasn't defiance. It was clarity. For years, he had perceived me as peripheral competent. Yes, but not central to decision-making. My quiet had registered as passivity. Now, sitting across from him, that perception was dissolving. I underestimated you, he said finally. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was simply true. I know, I replied. There was no satisfaction in saying it, no triumph, just acknowledgement. He nodded slowly. I built everything assuming I could hold it together, he said. I didn't plan for independent structures. Independent structures. That was the language of someone who finally understood. I'm not against the family. I said I'm for sustainability, for Mark, for whatever happens next. He looked at me differently then. Not as Abby, not as the quiet daughter-in-law who refilled glasses, but as someone who had been calculating long before the strain became visible. When we returned to the dining room, nothing appeared altered. Plates were set. Jenna laughed at something Caleb said. Diane adjusted the centerpiece. But something had shifted permanently. Not the hierarchy, the awareness. And awareness, once introduced, cannot be reversed. It's been a year since that conversation in Richard's study. The family still gathers on Sundays. The oak table is the same. The lake house still stands. The construction company survived its restructuring, smaller, leaner, less confident. From the outside, nothing dramatic happened. No lawsuits, no estrangements, no explosive holiday scenes. But internally, everything recalibrated. I no longer sit automatically at the end of the table. Not because I demanded a new seat, because no one unconsciously assigns it to me anymore. When financial topics arise, Richard looks at me directly now, not indulgently, not dismissively, directly. What's your take on that, he'll ask. Not to humor me, to understand. And I answer the same way I always have measured, precise, unemotional. The difference is not in my tone. It's in their perception. Jenna consults external advisors now before expanding anything. Caleb speaks more cautiously about leverage. Diane asks questions earlier, not after documents are signed. No one references family will figure it out anymore. They talk about documentation, about clarity, about exposure. It's subtle, but it's real. Mark and I remain structurally separate, not distant, not cold, simply defined. Our assets are clean, our liabilities are clear, our support, when offered, is deliberate and bounded. And here's what surprises most people when they hear this story. I don't feel resentful. I don't feel victorious. I don't even feel particularly changed. Because I was always this person. The only difference is that I stopped allowing others to interpret my quiet as absence. Silence, I've learned, is misunderstood by those who equate volume with authority. But silence can be layered. It can be patience. It can be an assessment. It can be preparation. And when necessary, it can be a boundary. For years, I stayed quiet at every family dinner, and they mistook that for weakness. What they didn't realize was that I was building an internal structure stronger than any verbal argument. Observation is power when you use it correctly. Not to control, not to humiliate, but to position yourself so that when systems shift as they always do, you remain steady. I still refill glasses sometimes. I still listen more than I speak. But now, when I choose silence, it's visible, not because it's loud, because it's understood. And that understanding changes everything. If you've stayed with me this long, you might have expected something louder, a dramatic takedown, a speech that silenced the room, a moment where everyone finally realized how wrong they'd been. That's not what happened. And that's the point. Power doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like preparation. For years, I stayed quiet at every family dinner, and they mistook that for weakness. They assumed that because I wasn't competing for attention. I wasn't calculating, because I didn't argue, I didn't understand. Because I smiled. I agreed. But silence is not submission. Silence is information gathering. It's emotional regulation. It's patience long enough to see the entire structure before you decide where to stand inside it. The truth is, I never needed to humiliate anyone to shift the dynamic. I didn't need to expose secrets or force apologies. I only needed to remove myself from assumptions. Once we clarified our boundaries, the system adjusted. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but honestly. And here's the deeper lesson I've learned. You don't have to announce your strength for it to exist. You don't have to correct every misunderstanding. You don't even have to defend yourself against subtle dismissal. Sometimes, the most powerful move is to let people believe you're small while you quietly build a life that doesn't depend on their perception at all. Observation is power when you use it correctly, not to dominate, but to remain unshaken. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever been underestimated because you were quiet? And if you were, did you shrink yourself to fit their version of you? Or did you start building something they couldn't see? I'd really like to know.